Good evening. Welcome to another important program of the International Grapevine. Tonight in the International Grapevine, we want to talk about two enduring, inspirational guys and that made such a big difference in America in a lot of things. We're talking about the great Harry Belafonte that we just lost a couple of months ago, unfortunately. Great singer, a great guy that was part of the civil rights movement, and a great friend of the great Martin Luther King, and again, a man that didn't have a problem telling it like it is. And the second guy on our program is, of course, the great actor Sidney Poitier. We feel pleased tonight to have the opportunity with Brother Hank Williams again, one of our special guests, to have the opportunity to talk about these two wonderful men that have made a difference. Like Sidney, never take a step backward, taking in the bad papers in the movies where black people will come out looking embarrassing and stuff like that. And of course, Harry Belafonte, that was born in Harlem in 1927, and he just passed away. And we want to talk a little bit about the things that they have done. Hank, welcome to our program. And again, it's a pleasure to have you on the program for this program that we want to do to talk about these two gentlemen, of course. Thank you for being our special guest, of course.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being back.
Okay. Well, I want the audience to have a flavor when we talk about them. I want you to describe a little bit just exactly who is Harry Belafonte and a little bit about his background.
You gave us a good start in terms of the broad outlines. Belafonte and Portier share a birth year in 1927. Both of them have Caribbean backgrounds, although a good bit of their formative years are spent in Harlem. Belafonte gets into performing relatively early, as does Portier, and they actually come up through relatively similar systems in terms of the intersections of where black artists can go at that point, which means institutions and performance spaces, at least in the beginning, primarily rooted in the black community, because that's the outlet you have at the time. One of the things that I think makes them one of the things that I think is very key to both of them is that they very quickly break out of that mold and achieve much wider fame. I mean, in the current way we would probably describe it currently, at least in terms of music, is you would say they are, quote unquote, crossover artists. But it means slightly different things at that time for kind of obvious reasons. And Belafonte, and the other thing is, Belafonte and Poitier both grow up struggling, at least economically. Belafonte talks about a good bit of that in his own autobiography here, which I'll share here, as does Portier in his, which I have over here and will refer to later on. But he gets a lot out of that. Number one is this connection with black working class and poor people, and a very particular empathy for them. But it's empathy born out of this shared experience and shared struggle, and really understanding at a very deep level exactly what their lives are like, because he had lived that. And he had lived it for a long time. And one of the very special things about him is that, even though obviously he catapults into superstardom and far beyond that, he always sort of carries that with him in a way that you don't always see from stars, even stars right now. Many of whom, after they actually escape the particular circumstances of before they made it big, or before they became stars, very quickly divorce themselves of that. Belafonte, even though he is moving in these increasingly rarefied spaces, seems to keep a good bit of that in his heart and kind of ingrained in his head. Some of which I think is sort of generational, which is a very key thing for both of them. And I guess the last thing, maybe the last thing I would share, to take a very slight but very important digression, is that Paul Robeson is kind of key to both, probably a little bit more so to Belafonte. But Robeson is not the first very large star to come out of the black community, but he is a very important one, and he is multi talented. He goes to Rutgers University. Plays football there on the college level. Is an All American, excels there. He also excels in baseball. So he's going back and forth between the two. Plays very briefly in early iteration of the NFL. Goes from there to law school at Columbia University. Finishes that. Decides after having an encounter with one of the legal people at the law firm he's working at, who refuses to take dictation from a black lawyer, that he's not going to follow in that career. And he then gets into a career of performing on stage, on screen, and recorded performance. And that's really where a lot of people know him from. But Robeson's intellect and the ability he has in all of these areas is just phenomenal, and something that is really kind of hard to comprehend. But I start out with Robeson partially because Robeson begins to give us sort of a 20th century archetype of what this type of success might look like. That's number one. But number two is that Robeson very early in his career commits himself to struggle, and he also very early commits himself to being a socially committed artist. And the other piece is that he essentially takes it upon himself to politically organize, and take under his wing a generation of black artists kind of coming after him. And that's kind of sort of where we begin to get Belafonte and Portier, entering this discussion, because they are standing on the shoulders of Robeson, but also are being mentored by Robeson and have that to look up to.
It's important to note also that Belafonte make no mistake about it, that Robertson was one of the greatest leaders that he's ever known, and he has followed him a lot in track in terms of philosophy, in terms of how he present the black man in America, and the way how he was tough, and the way he carried himself and made no apologies for the way he was. And Belafonte goes on to say that he learned so much from him, from Robertson, that was an amazing thing. That every time he talked about him, that he got emotional at certain times, which meant it covers a good portion of things that you talk about Robertson, his background, his way of being, and stuff like that. And what these two gentlemen learned from him, especially Belafonte, so to speak, it goes without saying that it uplifted them and took them a long way going forward. As you know, that Belafonte didn't mix words when he had
Mhm.
to talk for himself and defend himself. One of the things that we found very interesting is that even though he was born in Harlem, that his mother took him back to Jamaica, and he
Yes.
felt that it was a good move. Um, what was your interpretation when you read his biography when his mom decided to take him back to Jamaica, and why?
Well, it gives him this wider sense of the world, because obviously being poor in Harlem is one thing, and being poor in Jamaica in the circumstances he finds himself in is totally different experience altogether. you're talking about being up in the mountains of Jamaica as opposed to as opposed to being in Harlem. So there's a whole sort of mind shift and a whole sort of adjustment that he has to deal with there. But the other piece of it is that he is essentially left in the care of his grandmother, who is a white woman. So Belafonte, but is treated, but he's treated very, very well by her. So I think from that you begin to get part of the sense of what's going to shape Belafonte's life in terms of being a very outspoken, unapologetic advocate for Black people, but having the ability to move between the worlds, particularly in the United States. And some of that is going to kind of come into play when we begin talking about Poitier. Also leads into the strange colorism dynamics going on in performance. Arguably, we could say they still are, but certainly at that time, in terms of which, even though he is a Black man and there are issues he has to deal with, there are certain doors that are more easily open to him in terms of opportunity that aren't quite going to be open to Poitier. And Belafonte is absolutely sensitive to all that. But I think that is one of the things that he takes out of his experience in Jamaica. Aside obviously from the cultural aspects the cultural aspects in terms of how that very much widens his perspective, that become very evident, particularly in his musical career.
No question about it. I backed that up saying to you that when he came back from Jamaica and started singing and was discovering a lot of nightclubs, they were amazed. Very handsome young man, well spoken, and not only an actor, a great singer. Matter of fact, we know for a fact that the first uh, album that ever became a gold record album was his Calypso. And
Mhm.
he came into America with the calypso, and otherwise than calypso, he sang a lot of different songs in a lot of different clubs and stuff like that. But the amazing thing that I found with the calypso is the way he presented it. He wrote some of
Mhm.
the songs them, and if you go to Yankee Stadium a lot, you can hear one of his main songs all the time, Dejo, which is a big
Mhm.
song that talk about the slavery of the people in the boat, on the banana boat and stuff like that. And he had a tremendous, tremendous voice. Matter of fact, my understanding was that the first gold album that ever was done in New York or America was from him winning the Calypso album. And I mean, he from there he went on not only to singing but to acting, and he was very, very well received as a serious actor and, of course, a great singer. What was your impression with him as a singer?
Well, obviously, he's a phenomenal singer and performer, and I would say you even see the imprint of everything that he's experienced, everything that he's bringing to the table, the type of social sensibility that we know about him. You can see that's very evident in a lot of his songs. Deo, also known, colloquially known as the Banana Boat song, is a really good example of that. When you listen very closely to the lyrics, they're obviously very catching, very catchy, very easy to follow. But when you listen very carefully to them, he's also narrating you this very difficult life that these workers are going through. But he has the gift of being able to present it in a way that's accessible. And today we would say it's very pop friendly because it obviously it becomes a big hit. But in this case he is giving you very stark facts about the lives of people that that he actually wants to uplift, because again he has experienced this. He has people like this in his family. He has been around people like this. So that is part of his gift too. One of the things that the late Amiri Baraka, used to say about art is Baraka would say, the role of an artist is to be able to take, ordinary circumstances and be able to, be able to show them to people. In other words,
And expand
mirror
them.
back everyday life, but do it in a way that makes it so vivid that things that you see and might just gloss over, you have to confront them and sort of understand them in a different way. And Barack obviously does it in does that in a different way. You could say a more confrontational way in a lot of his work. But Belafonte is sort of doing similar things there, I would argue.
Well, Belafonte obviously was very talented. It's important to note, and we want to come into a two-part question for you. A tremendous movie he did with Carmen McRae back in 1954. Tremendous movie that I had the opportunity to see. I don't know if he mentioned it in his book, but more important, otherwise than the movies and the singing, his friendship that he made with Martin Luther King.
Mhm.
Belafonte got involved into the civil rights movement in a very, very serious manner. He was committed to it. He worked hard with it, and he became very close to Martin Luther King. Matter of fact, in many cases, when Martin Luther King needed a little bit of rest and needed to put his books some together, he went to Jamaica, and the
Mhm.
great Belafonte went with him. They became close friends, and I mean, the loss of Martin Luther King took a lot out of him. So
Mhm.
I would like you to talk to us a little bit about your impression of him in the civil rights movement and his friendship with Martin Luther King.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is really a key thing to kind of understanding Belafonte. Uh, his involvement and role is huge, and it goes very much beyond just raising money, which he does, donating his own money, which he does, signing checks and that kind of thing, which he does, and providing his apartment as kind of a key meeting space for people in the movement, which he does. But it also includes his own involvement at a level that you don't often see, particularly nowadays. You don't often see from people who are who are prominent at that level in the entertainment industry. And what I mean by that is beyond the obvious things that he can do. Movement needs money, movement needs outside support, that sort of thing. Belafonte is well placed to do that and understands it. He is also very much a key strategist in terms of being a sounding board for Dr. King, also being a little bit of an intermediary, because one of the things you have to realize in the civil rights movement is you have many different organizations. It's not just King. King is connected to Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but you also have SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At certain times of the movement, you have CORE, Congress of Racial Equality,
Mhm.
and other organizations. So, so kind of holding all this together and mediating some of the internal tensions is, very much an ongoing thing, as is strategy. Strategy is key. And of course, in hindsight, it's very easy just to look back and say, oh, well, they were right. But at the time, nobody knows exactly what's going to work. Nobody knows exactly how the different tactical decisions they make are going to play out. And Belafonte is right in the middle of that, in terms of, not only in terms of trying to provide kind of a neutral ground to keep all this thing together, but also as an interface with the Kennedys, particularly Bobby Kennedy.
Robert
So,
Kennedy.
that's part of the reason why I think Belafonte, and looking deeper into his story, is important, because you actually see somebody who has obviously the skills and popularity of an entertainer to be able to spread the message much more widely, but he has the intellect and nuance and this tactical understanding of actually being able to operate as part of the movement and also being, and also being respected for that. So in other words, it's not just Harry is bringing us a check, or Harry is helping us raise some money, both of which are very, very important details. But they respect him as being, part of those spaces. He doesn't just come and say show up for the benefit concert and fly out on his private jet or something like that. And there's actually a piece of his autobiography I'd like to read, but I'm not sure that we have time for that. Maybe at the end.
At the end, we'll do that. One of the things I want to bring up again is strong commitment to the civil rights movement, his strong commitment against guns out in the street, and he talks a lot about these weapons that most of the time kill people of color, but all the politicians worry about is having the authority to have weapon as they feel. But he confronted those type of things. One of the things that I saw with him, I don't know if you saw it, back in 1967, 68, the great Petula Clark came to America. She's an international singer from England,
Hmm.
and she was on the show. They sung a beautiful song together. At the end of the song, she held on to his arm, and
Wow.
the telephone went berserk at the television station from all those
I'm
crazy
sure
people
they
in the
did.
South who went nuts because a white woman held on to Belafonte. It was totally unbelievable. I saw that and I was in shock. I could not believe what I was seeing. Do you remember that scene on television, or you never saw it in person?
I'm obviously too young to have
You
seen it.
don't.
To have seen it firsthand. I know, I've read about it, and I'm sure the clip is up there. Clip is up there on YouTube. But the way you frame it is interesting, and I think some of the dynamics of that, I would say, are probably represent different things. But because Petula Clark is not from the United States, and obviously there are racial tensions in England, in some cases possibly even worse, depending on what you're talking about. But some of that removal of not necessarily being directly immersed in the racial dynamics of the United States, probably leads to that moment. But it also takes someone like Belafonte, who is, as I said, very much centered in terms of who he is, centered in terms of the struggle of Black people, but has that incredible ability to go between spaces and be comfortable with just about everybody, and also have a whole bunch of people who are comfortable with him.
No question about it. Well, we'll be right back on International Grapevine talking about the enduring inspiration of these two great men that was not only great artists, actors, singers, but real good friends like brothers. We'll be right back on International Grapevine as we go into part two to talk about Potier. We'll be right back on International Grapevine. And we're back here in International Grapevine tonight talking about two wonderful guys that we have lost. We lost Sidney Poitier and recently Harry Belafonte. Two great guys that made such a difference to the black community and the white community and people in general. Both of them were really committed. They met in Harlem as young men, and the friendship that they encompasses and put together as friends and as brother goes beyond imagination. Very close, each one of them. How Belafonte felt when Sidney passed away, and their friendship and stuff like that, and the speech that he gave. On this second part, we're going to spend some time talking about Sidney Poitier, who, again, like I said to you before we start, was a great actor, and we have our special guest who spent a good amount of time talking about the great Harry Belafonte And now we're going to spend some time talking a little bit about Sidney Poitier. Sidney Poitier was born in Miami. His parents came selling some tomatoes to Miami, and he was born before time, but he was raised in the Bahamas. And because of various problems that he had as youngsters, his father sent him to live with his oldest son in Miami. And Sydney went through a really, really tough time with the segregation in Miami, the way how black people was treated and stuff like that. We might not have enough time to get into it, but we want to talk a little bit about his background, how he came to be such a great actor. Let's talk a little bit, Hank. Uh, where where do you think Sydney stand in terms of his legacy as a man, as an actor, as a person who was also involved in the civil rights movement? I don't know with this intensity like Harry, but he was there. I know for a fact that along with Harry, they brought Charlton Heston to the movement to walk with Martin Luther
Hmm.
King. They brought quite a few white actors. I was shocked, but I saw the commitment from a lot of them who came because of Belafonte and because of Sydney. Let's talk a little bit about that, if me.
About his commitment to the civil rights movement, or about how he how he kind of comes into performance
Let's talk about how he
and
comes into performance
Mhm.
first.
Sure. Well, you covered the earlier part of his life, and Poitier finds his way back back to Harlem. He decides to devote himself to being an actor. It's not easy, to say the least. It's not easy for him at first, for a variety of reasons. Number one, he needs some training, so he needs to workshop his work. But he also has language issues, and issue just at first issues in terms of the types of scripts he's able to read.
And the
So
thick
he
accent
works.
also.
Yes, and that's the other piece. He he ends up with a fairly thick Caribbean accent that at this point you could probably, it might be a little bit more quote unquote acceptable, at least in terms of what he wants to do and where he wants to go. But at that time, he actually has to very much dedicate himself to Americanizing his speech, and very much toning down to the accent, to the point where obviously by the time he becomes a fairly large star, you can notice something there, but it has largely been eradicated. But I think one of the key things that I would highlight in terms of Poitier is the very important institution, the American Negro Theater, in Harlem, which is his training ground, and where he also begins to run in this circle of very important black performers. So not only is it a very important training ground, and probably one of the better ones you could have, when you realize some of the people who are involved with it, but it also begins to connect him to these wider movement ties, which you note that he has, although I would say correctly, to not quite the extent that Belafonte does. Although there's some nuance there in terms of why that's very important, but he acts in a play written by Alice Childress and Lorraine Hansberry, two very important playwrights that people have probably heard of. Probably more Hansberry than Childress, and he's also acting alongside incredible performers like Canada Lee, who if who viewers of a certain age will probably remember, or if you're very deep into black film and black stage, that name will ring a bell. Obviously, Paul Robeson is one of the key people who he interacts with and gets a little bit of gets a little bit of mentoring from. There's also a little bit of a cautionary tale because Robeson ends up having a very hard life at the end because he is blacklisted by the government, meaning at a very certain time because of suspected leftist activities, they people refuse to hire him. And because he refuses to, because Robeson refuses to fully collaborate with the with the McCarthy hearings, the government also very much restricts his ability to travel and takes away his passport for a while. So so they really try to break Robeson, and to a certain extent, kind of do, or at least they break him economically because they stop his ability to travel outside of the U.S. and perform there, and his abilities to perform inside the U.S. are very much stunted by that too. So he's very much restricted to performing on the so-called Chitlin circuit. But I bring that around because Belafonte and Portier take some lessons from that. Positive lessons in most cases, in terms of thinking, in terms of a not only getting that mentoring from Robeson, but also b seeing kind of a cautionary tale in terms of knowing that they have to be very strategic in terms of how they act. However, of course, in the case of Belafonte, it does not dissuade him from getting involved in the movement and doing what he needs to do. And that is also the case for Portier. Because being involved with wider figures in the movement and some of these popular entertainers works on both levels. It deals with what he feels he needs to do in terms of being part of the wider thing that's going on at the time, and it's putting him into contact with other performers who are also very serious about their craft. Ozzie Davis and Ruby D being probably being two of the better known names that people might remember coming out of there.
Well, it's interesting the things that you put together. I want to put a couple other things together for you to go from there. Actually, when Potier first went to Harlem and they put him to read, he was not able to read and was
Yes.
very disappointed and he was driven away. He started working in a restaurant as a dishwasher,
Hmm.
but that aura to go back into Harlem to learn the craft pushed him. He was lucky enough to met an old Jewish guy working in a restaurant who helped him to read for about 6 or 7 months, teach him where a comma,
Hmm.
a period is, and that really truly helped him. By the second time he went back, he was in a much better position, and also a little bit of luck. There was a play that was supposed to take place in Harlem, and the person to do the play was Harry Belafonte of all person, and
Hmm.
Belafonte was not able to make it, and Sidney got the opportunity, and it came through not as strong as Belafonte, but he came through enough, and Belafonte was very happy for him, and that was where the stage for Sidney opened up. But their friendship locked and was so tight as brothers. There was no bickering among them. And one of the things I want to put out before you answer all these questions is that Sidney, once he became semi-famous, he never took a part that he felt that would embarrass the black man or the black
Hmm.
community. He was very straightforward, and I mean, he worked a lot to keep or face properly in terms of the positive manner. So I give both of them a lot of
Hmm.
credit on the fact that they link together in a chain of love and strength, pulling together to get to the finish line, which they did with a lot of authority and with a lot of record to prove it. So, like I said, both of them work very, very hard.
Hmm.
Matter of fact, in some cases, there was a lot of things that they brought for him to play in the movies, and he said, "No, I won't do it."
Hmm.
So Any comment on your part about these things that I just mentioned?
I thought you laid it out very well. The thing about Poitier, which I think he gets beat up a little bit on, in once you get into the 1970s and some of the so-called black exploitation films and that kind of thing, is the type of character he portrays in a lot of the films that really kind of make a name for himself. You know, Lilies of the Field, Heat of the Night, Guess who's coming to dinner, To Sir with Love, that kind of thing. There's, you know, he's playing a certain type of character, very much straight, and I don't very much straight in terms of how he's going forward. Very strong characters, but you get a sense that he to a certain extent he's locked in terms of how he can react in certain situations and what he can do. Obviously, one fairly big thing that he runs into is how you're going to deal with the question of a love interest, which, if you're a mainstream Hollywood actor, that's one of the key things, and that's one of the things that he sort of bumps up against at that point in mainstream film, and being a very dark skinned black man. But what I would say, and I think what we came to understand earlier, is that Poitier comes in at a very important point in terms of the history of film and the history of the country, but in terms of sort of laying down a foundation for showing for showing essentially what black actors can do. Not that that wasn't done before, to a certain extent actually needed to be done, but to much wider audiences who tend not to have very good generational memory. Poitier becomes this sort of breakout star who is able, in a lot of ways, like Belafonte in music, to be able to travel between worlds, and also star in different types of films. But as you say, he also has the ability to say stuff that he's not going to do and still progress in his career. So he doesn't have to make the type of, say, sacrifices that someone like
Okay.
Mantan Moreland has to do, or people who come along just a little bit earlier than him to be able to achieve the type of mainstream success that Poitier does.
Well, one of the things that most important, I think, 1967, he was probably the biggest box office actor out there with three or four movies that I'll name to you that were either one of them. He could have easily won an Oscar in all four of them.
Hmm.
In the Heat of the Night, which is one of the greatest movies that I ever saw with him, that was done in the South with Rod Steiger. To Sir with Love, that he did in England. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? With another great one that was made in San Francisco. And the other one escaped my mind. Uh, One of the things, again, because of the racist situation, he made a movie where I think he was dating a blind girl in the movie and he kissed her. But when it was shown in the South, they cut that part out. And,
Right.
he went through quite a few things then. I mean, 67 was a powerful year for him. But by the same token, there was some in our community who was not on board with him, felt that he should have taken more of an aggressive part in certain situations. And Sidney response to that was, I did what I had to do in the movies for myself and for you, my people. And I want you
Hmm.
to understand that. We must remember this. These things them started in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and it's difficult. Is one of the few actors, black or white, that achieve the things that he achieved, that things him all the way up to the 60s or 70s, that goes without saying, that was very strong. What do you feel, what do you think about those who kind of critique him that felt that he didn't come across well in the black community?
I think you framed it fairly well in terms of in terms of what he was trying to do, and in terms of what he kind of had the freedom to do, particularly at the time, particularly at the time period he comes through. But the one thing we have to remember is it's things look radically different from 1967 to even just a few short years later, when 1970, 71, 72, early 1970s, after you get Shaft, and then you get a whole bunch of films sort of in that mold, some of which better than others. But there's a big, there's kind of a lot happens in a lot happens in very few years, and it happens very fast in terms of what sort of, and a good bit of that is sort of paralleling the strength of the Black Power movement. As one of the things that happens is there's sort of a redefinition in terms of how Black people are going to present themselves, and how that negotiation is going to be with the rest of society. So those are some of the wider things that are going on, that Poitier is trying to negotiate, and he's working a he's walking a tightrope, a very much of a fine balance between between all these forces going on. And the other piece is, I think personally, Poitier was just not quite that type of person, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because one of the things that you find that you need different types of personalities and people with different types of strengths, which is part of the reason there's always a call to have more people to represent what's going on, so you don't freight any one person with things that really aren't their strength. And what I think we get out of Poitier is that he is able to move the needle very much for what the next generation of Black actors can do. That's number one. But number two, number two, he's successfully able to show that Black actors can absolutely have the chops to take any kind of role that you throw at them. Again, not something that's new. We see that with Robeson. We could go back even earlier. We
Yes.
see that with Ira Aldridge. But again, people have very short memories in terms of how those things work. And what Poitier is able to do is very successfully bring it into the modern era of film.
I got a two-part questions for you. Did stardom ever shield Potier from racism? One. And after you answer that question,
First
was
question is easy. No.
go like straight up?
So we can
Uh,
move on to the second one.
yeah. Was he the first black actor that ever won an Oscar?
Second one I actually can't answer off the top of my head.
I think the lady from Miss McDonald, that did that great movie in Georgia with this actor, the name escaped my mind. I think she was the first one to win an Oscar, but I think after her, it became Sydney. Sydney won quite a few
Hmm.
awards, and deserving so, and he made a big name for himself. I think when the '70s came in, he kind of slowed down a little bit and went behind the camera. He went
Yes.
behind the camera as a director. A couple of films that he did with the same Belafonte. He did some with maybe about three or four comedies that was very well received and stuff like
Mhm.
that. A lot of people was kind of surprised because he was a very serious actor, but I mean, it was a changing of the time with different times, so
Mhm.
you adjust to that. Comedy was in, and he did maybe about three or four comedy movies where he was the producer and responsible for it, and came
And I
back with
think
some good
and I
reviews.
think and I think that's a key piece too, because Uptown Saturday Night which he does with Bill Cosby and Belafonte. I believe that comes out in 1974. Let's
Hmm.
Do It Again, which comes out in 75, and Piece of the Action, which comes out in 77 with Cosby. And, later on, and this is something that may be a little bit more accessible to some of your viewers, Stir Crazy, 1980. He's not, he doesn't actually act in that, but that is with, the incredible comedy duo of Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. But all of those are done
That was
through
something.
his, yeah, but all those are done through his production company. So even though they're comedies, and to a certain extent it's lighter fare, but it also represents a very important step in terms of the involvement and control of black folk in the film industry, and the ability to, and actually the ability to have much greater control over what's going to be on the screen, and the type of things that you see, because you don't really see, even though they're comedies, and there's a little bit of slapstick, you don't really see some of the coonery and buffoonery that you see in earlier films, and even some of the stuff from the 1970s that begins to go off the rails a little bit.
For most of the greatest movies that he made, the producer was always Stanley Kramer. Stanley Kramer always talked about the work that Potier did, that he found him to be one of the greatest actors and that he ever worked with, and that he would recommend him for almost any kind of film. And matter of fact, I think one of the first one that he did was the one where he and Tony Curtis were chained together. I saw that
Mhm.
one as a young kid. I don't want to give up my age there, but that
That would
was
be
some
the
some
Defiant ones.
yeah, the Defiant ones.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, that movie came out 1958, if my memory is right,
Mm.
and that was a tremendous movie. Matter of fact, Tony Curtis said that they wanted to give uh, Potier second billing, and he said no. We both should have the same top billing. Did you have the opportunity to saw that movie and then feeling one way or the other about it?
I've seen it, but to be honest, it's a very long time ago.
Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit. I know for a fact that he was involved into the civil rights movement. How
Mhm.
deep was he in it? Was he as deep into the civil rights movement as Harry Belafonte?
He did not quite have the base level of commitment that Belafonte did, in terms of being kind of as central a figure as Belafonte was, which I don't really want to. I think we have to be careful in terms of putting shade on Portier because of that. He is, even though he does not, at least externally, seem to have the level of involvement that Belafonte does. He has a deep commitment to the movement too, but we also have to remember that they're doing different things. And to a certain extent, Belafonte commits what you would assume would be career suicide in the mold of Robeson, in terms of his commitment to the movement, in terms of how many waves he does, and
He put his
also in
neck on the
terms of
line.
what's that?
He put his neck on the line.
Yes, he does. And there's definitely, both of them aware there's definitely a price to be paid for that. But what I also say to my students is that if standing on principle were easy, everybody would do it all the time, and there wouldn't be there wouldn't be any question about it. So standing on principle is going to cost you. It's just a question of how much the cost is going to be, how much you balance how much it's worth, and how big a hit you're willing to take. And Belafonte, I think, partially because of his career trajectory, is able to do a few things that Portier isn't, because I think he has a little bit more leeway, as primarily, although certainly not only, as primarily being known as a singer and vocal performer than as somebody who is very much tied to, very much tied to the mainstream Hollywood structure, which you have to remember at that point, if you want to really succeed in film, it is more or less through the Hollywood studio system. And there's, kind of a very narrow path that you can take. And that's kind of where the comment I made earlier about colorism coming back into it. Poitier is, very much aware of that whole piece of it, and that whole piece of it in terms of how he has to navigate this system and actually have a career in it. So part of it is his calculation in terms of how much he can do. I think some of it is just his personality, and he doesn't quite have the same type of personality that Belafonte does. But he is dragged. Well, I shouldn't say dragged, but he is pulled into it by by number one, the strength of the wider movement. Two, his personal commitments, which I don't really think we should dismiss, and three, very much the friendship with Belafonte. And Belafonte brings him into a few escapades that kind of go
Got him
be you know
involved.
be
Mhm.
yeah, that kind of go beyond Poitier's comfort level, and with a few of them would probably go beyond the comfort level of vast majority of us, because Belafonte is kind of fearless.
No question about it. Well, unfortunately, we're kind of running into a little bit of time. I would like to take this opportunity first to ask you to read something that we were talking about, Belafonte. I don't want to close out without you doing that because both of them did a wonderful job. But Belafonte was always in the front of the line all the time, and I welcome that you're going to read on the program to close out.
Thank you for that, and I'll try and do this fairly quickly. Again, this is from his autobiography.
Sure.
You can probably still get a hold of Poitier's autobiography. Here that's very available. But I'll read you. I guess to follow up on what we had just finished talking about it,
Talking about, yes.
a memory from Belafonte from his time in the civil rights movement, and just to very quickly situate people and give you the backstory. It is well, I'll actually just start reading and then give the backstory. So this is how the book starts. The phone rang late in the evening in my New York apartment. It was the night of August 4th, 1964, a night of grief and anger for all of us in the civil rights movement, but especially those in Mississippi. We've got a crisis on our hands down here, the young man on the line said. We need help. And so there he's good, so there he goes into some of the background, but the big thing is the murders of the three civil rights activists, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, who are basically arrested, then released into a trap by the Klan, and they're sort of captured on this dark road and pulled out of their car. All of them are pistol whipped and shot. Cheney, which is the only black one of the three, kind of he gets tortured in some really sadistic and horrible ways before he's killed. So this is kind of the background. This is kind of the background and the setup to what you're going to hear next. So they call Belafonte because they need resources. They need money because the SNCC volunteers want to stay on, and so you need money for that. You're also going to need money for legal resources and all that sort of thing, and they need it fast. So it has to be raised quickly, and Belafonte realizes that he has to get it down there himself, and he takes Poitier with him. So they fly down major airport, then fly to this smaller airport, in this tiny little plane that basically drops them off, get picked up by SNCC volunteers, Plane takes off, and then they take off in this car chase where they basically head off the clan and are taken to stay in this little safe house. I'd say quote unquote safe because there's constant violence down there. But very quickly, here's Belafonte's recollection of that night. Let's see. So outside the barn that they were in, uh, Ku Klux Klanners sat in idling cars. We could hardly keep them out of Greenwood. That day, planes had flown overhead, dropping KKK leaflets that urged Mississippians not to let the niggers steal their rights. I'm not going to edit it and do him the favor of that. Late that night, after a dinner of chicken and spare ribs, Sydney and I were escorted to the house where we were to sleep, with armed guards patrolling outside. Our bedroom had one double bed, not too big a double bed either, shoved up against a wall under a window. Sydney blanched. Look, I'll take the inside, okay, I told him, meaning the side by the wall. I meant it as a concession. I'd be the one scrunched in by my snoring bedmate. Sydney gave me a suspicious look. Yeah, but if someone sticks a gun through that window and shoots, I'll be more apt to get hit. He was only half joking. Okay, I'll take the outside, I said. Sydney thought about it. If I was willing to take the outside, maybe it was the better side after all. No, I'll take the outside, he said. If you get shot, I'd hate to have to climb over your dead ass to get to the door. In bed with the light out, we talked for a while. I told Sydney some of my ghost stories. Finally, I fell into a ragged street, only to be awakened in the pitch darkness by a strange rasping sound. I reached over to nudge Sydney awake. The other side of the bed was empty. The rasping sound was louder. Sydney? Yes, he replied. What the F are you doing? Push-ups, Sydney said. I can't sleep. And when those MFers come for us, I want to be sure I'm ready. And there you go. And you can. It's the rest of it is incredibly gripping. But
I can imagine. I remember those three youngsters that left and went to the South for recruitment and to help with voting rights, and then never came back. And I remember Cheney very well. Awful situation, awful situation. Brother Hank, I don't have words to thank you for being on our program and answering these questions, and reading what you just read just brought me back some tough memories, hard to understand and to digest. But I thank you for being my special guest, and I hope to have you back on the Grapevine soon. That's for sure.
thank you very much, as usual, for doing this important program, and look forward to being back.
Good. And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night and saying to you, we hope to see you next week at the same time, at the same place, right here on International Grapevine. Good night.